I stood by the window, watching as Tom pulled out of the driveway, his headlights flashing momentarily before the darkness of early morning swallowed them. He had an important conference out of state, the kind of opportunity he would have been thrilled about a few years ago. Now it was just another reason he'd be gone for days, leaving me behind in our pristine, perfectly arranged home. I exhaled, leaning against the cold glass, feeling the early bite of morning air even through the pane. The silence of the house felt sharper than usual, like it was mocking me. In the quiet, I heard only the faint ticking of the kitchen clock and the hum of the refrigerator, reminders of the monotony that now colored every corner of my life. It hadn't always been like this. Tom and I used to fill our home with laughter, with the kind of warmth that made you feel like you could survive anything. But life had crept in his demanding job, the long hours, and the unspoken tension that settled in our routines. I told myself it was normal, that every marriage went through phases, but in the dark hours of the night, I often wondered if this phase would ever end. Then there was Jake. He'd moved in just a month ago, 2 doors down, in the charming blue house with the wraparound porch. I didn't think much of him at first, other than noticing how he effortlessly slipped into the rhythm of our quiet suburban neighborhood. He was hard not to notice, though, with his easy confidence and warm smile, which he flashed at everyone he met. He always seemed to be around, whether watering his lawn, chatting with the neighbors, or jogging past my house, just as I'd step outside for some air. And whenever we exchanged a polite hello, I could feel his eyes linger a moment longer than necessary. It was all innocent enough, I reasoned, just polite greetings and a few exchanges about the weather or neighborhood gossip. Nothing more, but lately I found myself glancing out the window more often, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, wondering if he'd be there to break the spell of my endless solitude. I spent most of the morning trying to busy myself with mundane tasks around the house. I dusted every corner, reorganized my pantry, even tackled the overgrown ivy creeping up the garden wall. Yet, every little creak of the house, every car passing by outside drew my attention back to the window. Around noon, I spotted him, Jake, in his usual workout gear, jogging down the sidewalk, his pace steady and relaxed. I tried to act nonchalant, fussing over the ivy, but my eyes kept drifting his way. When he passed in front of my house, he slowed, lifting a hand in a casual wave. "Hey, Rachel," he called, his voice breaking the silence that had felt suffocating all morning. "Hey, Jake," I replied, brushing off dirt from my hands and smiling. "Out for your daily run?" He nodded, taking a few steps onto my lawn. "Couldn't stay inside with a day like this," he said, his gaze drifting from the sky down to me. "You seem busy, though. Are you gardening?" "Trying to," I laughed, feeling the sudden urge to smooth down my hair. "I'm not exactly what you'd call a green thumb." He grinned, glancing at the overgrown plants trailing along the wall. "I think it's got character. Besides, it suits you natural, not too pruned. That's rare around here." There was a slight mischievous tone in his voice, just enough to make my stomach flutter. I felt myself blush, something I hadn't done in ages. "Well, thank you," I think. For a moment we stood there, caught in a comfortable silence. I felt like I should say something, to fill the quiet between us, but I couldn't quite find the words. Jake seemed perfectly content with the pause, his gaze drifting lazily across the garden before he looked back at me. "Anyway, I should get back to my run," he finally said, though he made no effort to move. "But I'll catch you later, Rachel." "Sure, see you around, Jake." As he jogged away, I could feel the smile lingering on my lips, the warmth of the encounter wrapping around me. The entire exchange was so harmless, so neighborly, yet it left me feeling more alive than I had in months. I shook my head, mentally chastising myself for letting my mind wander. But the moment kept replaying, lingering on the way he'd looked at me, as if he'd seen me in a way no one else had in years. I spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the strange mix of emotions swelling inside me. By the time the evening shadows lengthened, I had almost convinced myself that it was nothing, a casual interaction, a brief moment of friendly attention. Yet, as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the anticipation that fluttered in my chest. The next morning, I was drawn to the window before I even knew what I was looking for. A restless feeling had settled over me, one that couldn't be satisfied by my usual routines. I half hoped to see Jake out and about, and I almost laughed at myself for acting like a schoolgirl with a silly crush. By mid-morning, I heard a knock at the door. My heart leapt, and I scolded myself for it, but I couldn't stop the rush of excitement as I swung the door open. There he was, holding a small toolbox. "Hey, I noticed your garage door's a little stuck," he said, glancing over his shoulder at it. "Thought I'd swing by and see if you needed a hand with it." "Oh wow, that's so kind of you," I stammered, surprised he'd noticed something so small. "I didn't even realize it was broken." "Yeah, I saw it the other day. Figured I'd offer my handyman services," he grinned, gesturing with the toolbox. "You okay if I take a look?" "Of course, go ahead," I said, stepping aside as he made his way to the garage. Inside, he moved with ease, inspecting the rollers and tracks with a steady, practiced hand. I watched from the doorway, suddenly aware of how quiet the house was with just the two of us inside. As he worked, he made small talk, asking about Tom, about life in the neighborhood, keeping everything casual and light. And yet, beneath his words, there was an unmistakable energy, the kind of awareness that simmered in the silence between our sentences. "So, Tom travels a lot, huh?" he asked, not looking up from his work. "Yeah," I replied, a slight sigh escaping before I could stop it. "It's been a busy year for him." He nodded, pausing to look over his shoulder at me, his eyes holding something I couldn't quite decipher. It must get a little lonely. I hesitated, my heart hammering at the subtle intensity in his gaze. Sometimes, I admitted, forcing a small laugh. "But that's life, right?" "Right?" he murmured, his gaze holding mine for a heartbeat too long. The moment was electric, the kind of silence that hummed with words left unspoken. When he finally looked away, the spell broke, leaving me feeling both relieved and disappointed. He finished the repair, testing the garage door a few times before closing his toolbox. "Well, that should do it," he said, his voice casual once more. "Good as new." "Thank you, Jake," I said, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in my chest as I walked him to the door. "You didn't have to do this." "Anytime, Rachel," he replied, his voice warm. "That's what neighbors are for." As he left, I stood by the door, my hand still on the knob. I could still feel the ghost of his presence, the charge in the air that lingered long after he'd gone. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen, noticed in a way that stirred something deep within me, a part of myself I thought I had lost. The days that followed were filled with small moments, each one leaving a mark on me. Sometimes he'd wave as he passed by, a casual greeting that somehow felt intimate. Other times I'd catch a glimpse of him from my kitchen window, and my heart would do that ridiculous leap again, as if he were something new and forbidden. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as a passing infatuation, but the more I resisted, the stronger the pull became, like a string slowly tightening, drawing us closer together with each encounter. One afternoon I was out for a walk, trying to clear my head. I needed fresh air, a break from the strange thrill that had taken over my mind. But of course, as if fate were testing me, Jake was outside, working in his yard. He looked up as I approached, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, his smile easy and warm. "Fancy meeting you here," he teased, leaning against the fence. "I just needed some air," I replied, feeling foolish under his gaze. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," I replied, a touch too breathless, betraying more than I intended. And then, without thinking, I added, "I was actually hoping I'd run into you." His smile widened, but there was a flicker of something else in his expression, something darker, something intrigued. "Well, here I am," he said softly, his voice laced with a quiet intensity. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, the silence stretching out like an unspoken invitation. There was a part of me that wanted to step closer, to let go of the tension that had been building for weeks. But before I could act, the familiar sound of footsteps on gravel broke the spell. I glanced over my shoulder, spotting one of our neighbors heading towards their house, blissfully unaware of the moment they had interrupted. I turned back to Jake, who was watching me with a knowing look. "Maybe we'll have more luck next time," he murmured, his tone half joking, half serious. I swallowed, feeling a rush of excitement mingled with guilt. Yeah, maybe. As I walked away, my heart was pounding, each step feeling heavier with the weight of my emotions. There was no denying it now, this was more than just a friendly connection. Something dangerous had awakened, something that could easily slip out of my control if I wasn't careful. But as I returned home, my mind wandered back to him, to the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel. It was a thrill I hadn't felt in years, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the thought of it. The next few days were like walking a tightrope. Every routine moment was punctuated by flashes of Jake's face, the sound of his laugh, or the intense way he'd looked at me that day by the fence. I couldn't shake the thought of him, and each time my phone buzzed or a car door slammed, I felt a quick thrill of anticipation, hoping it would be him. Tom's calls from the conference became shorter, his voice strained. He apologized for being busy and promised he'd make time for us when he returned. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me barely noticed. Late Friday afternoon, I was alone in the house again, trying to keep myself occupied with a book that I could barely concentrate on. The words blurred together as my mind drifted back to Jake. Just then, as if conjured by my thoughts, I heard a familiar sound, the faint rumble of his car engine idling just outside. I felt a thrill of nervous energy as I peeked out the window. Jake was unloading a few bags from his trunk. I watched him for a moment, feeling like a thief in my own home, stealing glances that I knew I shouldn't be taking. Before I could think twice, I slipped on a light cardigan and stepped outside, hoping my sudden interest in the mail looked natural. "Hey, Rachel," he called, his face lighting up the moment he saw me. I waved, trying to keep my cool as I walked over to the edge of my driveway. "Hey, Jake. Running errands?" "Yeah, just picking up some things for the weekend," he replied, flashing that warm, easy smile. "You have any plans?" "Nothing exciting, just catching up on some reading," I said, feeling a slight thrill as he walked closer, bags in hand. "Tom's still away." He nodded, setting the bags down on his front porch. "You know, I was just about to fire up the grill. I hate cooking for one. Care to join?" The invitation caught me off guard. I felt the urge to say no, to keep a safe distance, but the idea of sitting across from him, just the two of us, was too tempting to resist. "Sure," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. "It's been a while since I've had grilled anything." A spark of excitement lit up his eyes. "Great. I'll start up the grill. Give me 10 minutes. I nodded, my heart racing as I returned inside to freshen up, even though I knew it was silly. It wasn't like this was a date. But as I adjusted my hair and smoothed down my blouse, I realized I cared about looking nice. Just for this one evening, I wanted to feel noticed. When I arrived at Jake's place, the warm scent of charcoal and grilled meat wafted through the air. He greeted me with a warm smile, motioning to a small table set up with plates and glasses, candles flickering softly against the evening twilight. "Hope you like steak," he said, taking the thick, sizzling cuts off the grill and placing them onto our plates. "I'm sure it'll be great," I replied, settling into my seat. I couldn't help but glance around, noticing how his house had a casual, lived-in charm. It was so different from my own meticulously arranged home, where everything was placed just so. We chatted about the neighborhood, our favorite restaurants, even some random memories from childhood. But as the evening wore on, our conversation grew quieter, more personal. I felt myself opening up, sharing things I hadn't thought about in ages, like the dreams I once had before life became a series of routines. Jake listened, his gaze steady and attentive, making me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. The night deepened, and we found ourselves lingering over our empty plates, the soft glow of the candles casting shadows across his face. I could feel a pull, a current that seemed to draw us closer with each passing minute. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice low, filled with something I couldn't name. "I don't want to overstep, but it's hard to ignore this connection." I looked down, a wave of nerves washing over me. "Jake," I started, but the words caught in my throat. I wanted to tell him that I felt it too, that I was drawn to him in ways I didn't fully understand. But the reality of it was terrifying, a line I wasn't sure I could cross. He reached out, gently brushing his fingers over the back of my hand. It was such a small, innocent gesture, but it sent a spark of electricity through me. I felt my heart pounding, each beat louder than the last. Slowly I looked up, meeting his gaze. His eyes were filled with an unspoken question, a vulnerability that mirrored my own. But before I could respond, a sudden rush of headlights splashed across the windows as a car pulled up down the street. I jerked my hand back, reality crashing down around me. We both looked away, the moment broken, but the tension lingered, thick and palpable. I should probably go, I stammered, rising from my chair, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. He stood too, his face unreadable. Rachel, thanks for coming. Really. I don't know the last time I enjoyed someone's company this much. I forced a small smile, my heart twisting as I turned toward the door. Me too, I whispered, unable to bring myself to look back. That night, I lay awake, my mind replaying every second of the evening, the way his hand had felt against mine, the intensity in his eyes. Part of me wanted to forget it all, to brush it off as a fleeting moment of weakness. But the other part, the part that had been aching for something more, couldn't let it go. The memory of his touch lingered, like a ghost haunting the quiet dark. The following morning, I tried to throw myself into chores, hoping to keep my mind occupied. But around noon, I heard a soft knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, finding Jake standing there, looking slightly uncertain. "Hey," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just wanted to make sure we're okay." I smiled, feeling my resolve waver. "Of course, Jake. It was a nice evening, really." He nodded, his gaze searching mine. "Good. I didn't want to make you uncomfortable. I really enjoy talking with you, Rachel. It's like, I don't know, you just get it, you know?" "I feel the same," I admitted, a little too quickly. "It's nice to have someone who listens." He gave a soft, rueful smile, his eyes holding that same intensity I couldn't seem to escape. "Well, if you ever need to talk, I'm here." I nodded, forcing myself to step back. "Thanks, Jake. Really." As I closed the door, I felt a pang of regret, like I was closing off a part of myself. But I reminded myself that this was the right thing, that I couldn't let myself get pulled into something I'd regret. Yet, despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that followed me throughout the day. A week went by and I tried to avoid him, tried to keep my distance. But fate seemed to have other plans. One evening, as I returned from running errands, I found Jake outside, fixing his car in the driveway. "Rachel," he called, a wide grin breaking across his face. "Just the person I needed." I hesitated, my pulse quickening. "What's going on?" "My car battery's dead," he explained, scratching his head. "You wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" "Yeah, I think so," I replied, moving towards my garage. "Let me check." I found the cables and brought them over, trying to ignore the way my hands trembled as he took them from me. We worked in comfortable silence, and when the engine roared back to life, he gave a cheer, grinning like a kid. "Thank you. Seriously, you saved me," he said, his laughter infectious. "It was nothing," I replied, feeling the warmth of his smile seep into me. Before I knew it, we were talking again, the sun setting around us as the conversation flowed easily, effortlessly. "I'm glad you came over," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "I missed this." I swallowed, my heart pounding as he stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. It was like he was reading every thought, every secret I was trying to hide. "I missed it too," I admitted, barely recognizing my own voice. For a moment we just stood there, the world fading away. And then, as if pulled by an invisible force, I found myself leaning in, closing the distance between us. Our lips met in a tentative kiss, soft and lingering, like a question waiting to be answered. When we finally pulled away, I could see the same mix of wonder and fear in his eyes that I felt. We didn't say anything, didn't need to. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. As I walked back to my house, my heart racing and my mind spinning, I knew I was stepping into something dangerous, something that could unravel everything. But in that moment, with the memory of his kiss still warm on my lips, I couldn't bring myself to care. That night, I lay awake, haunted by the memory of his touch. I knew this was a road I shouldn't go down, but the thrill, The excitement was too intoxicating to ignore. For the first time in years, I felt alive, like I was breaking free from a cage I hadn't even realized I was in. But as I drifted off to sleep, a small voice echoed in the back of my mind, reminding me that every choice has a price. And as much as I wanted to ignore it, I knew deep down that this wouldn't end easily. The next day, the world seemed a little brighter, colors sharper, even the mundane tasks of life infused with an energy I hadn't felt in ages. But as much as I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed, I knew that was a lie. Something between Jake and me had shifted, and the more I thought about it, the harder it became to focus on anything else. Throughout the week, we exchanged brief texts, small, seemingly innocent messages. Sometimes he'd comment on a funny show he'd watched or share a random observation about the neighborhood, and each time my phone pinged, a thrill shot through me, filling me with a giddy excitement I couldn't contain. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, I got a text from him I keep thinking about the other night. I stared at the words, feeling my heartbeat quicken. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. But before I could think too much, my fingers typed back, "Me too." A few seconds later, another message came through. "Are you free later?" I bit my lip, glancing around the empty house as if someone might overhear. My heart raced as I typed my response. "I could be." "Great," he replied. "Meet me by the lake at 6. The lake was tucked away in a secluded corner of the neighborhood, a quiet spot where people rarely went unless they were walking their dogs or seeking a moment of solitude. The idea of meeting him there, of being alone together, felt both exhilarating and forbidden. By the time 6 o'clock rolled around, I was already parked near the lake, the soft glow of twilight casting shadows over the water. I spotted Jake's car parked a little further down, and when I stepped out, he was already there, waiting by the edge of the water. "Hey," he said, his voice soft as he approached. "Hey," I replied, my own voice barely a whisper. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, the unspoken tension simmering between us. The air felt heavy, like it was charged with electricity, each second stretching out as we lingered on the edge of something neither of us dared to name. Without thinking, I stepped closer, feeling his warmth as I looked up at him. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt a spark, a thrill that sent a shiver down my spine. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice filled with that same intensity from before. "I know this is complicated, but I can't stop thinking about you." I swallowed, my heart pounding as I took in the vulnerability in his gaze. "I can't stop either," I admitted, feeling the weight of my words sink into the quiet between us. He took a deep breath, his hand still hovering over mine. "I don't want to make things harder for you, but I also don't want to pretend this isn't real." His words hung in the air, a confession that echoed in the stillness. I looked down, feeling a mix of fear and exhilaration. Every instinct told me to walk away, to put distance between us, but something stronger held me in place, grounding me in the moment. Before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Our lips met in a soft, lingering kiss, a mixture of hesitation and desire. I felt his hand on my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened, filling me with a warmth that chased away every doubt, every question. When we finally pulled away, I felt a strange sense of peace, like I had found something I didn't even know I was looking for. Over the next few weeks, Jake and I fell into a rhythm, a series of stolen moments, whispered confessions, and fleeting touches that left me breathless. We were careful, always meeting in secluded places, always keeping our encounters brief, yet each one left me craving more. It felt like a dance, a delicate balance between what was and what could never be, a thrill that kept me grounded in a way I hadn't felt in years. But the secrecy began to take its toll. Every time Tom called, I felt a pang of guilt, a reminder that I was walking a line I could never come back from. I told myself it was harmless, that it was just a passing attraction, but the deeper I fell, the harder it became to keep the truth at bay. One evening, I was sitting on the back porch, sipping a glass of wine and watching the sunset when my phone buzzed. It was Jake. "Can I come over? Just for a minute?" I hesitated, glancing at the empty house around me. Tom was still away for the weekend, and the idea of having Jake here, in my own home, felt thrilling and terrifying all at once. Yes, I typed back, feeling a rush of excitement as I hit send. Within minutes, there was a quiet knock at the door. I opened it to find Jake standing there, his face lit by the warm glow of the porch light. Without a word, he stepped inside, his gaze intense as he took in the room. "It's strange being here," he murmured, his voice low. "It feels intimate." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. We'd always met outside in neutral places that held no meaning, but here, in the quiet familiarity of my home, everything felt different, more real, more fragile. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, and I felt that same spark, the same pull that had drawn us together from the beginning. We stood there, our hands entwined, each breath filling the silence between us. "You have no idea how hard it's been to stay away," he whispered, his gaze locked on mine. "Jake," I started, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I wanted to say but couldn't. Before I could finish, he leaned in, capturing my lips in a kiss that felt like a confession, a promise, and a question all at once. I felt his arms wrap around me, pulling me close as the world melted away, leaving only the warmth of his embrace, the taste of his kiss. We spent hours like that, lost in each other, every kiss, every touch feeling like a new beginning. It was reckless, a choice I knew I would regret, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. It was just us, tangled together in a dance of longing and desire that left me breathless. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, we lay side by side, our fingers intertwined, the silence filled with unspoken words. I knew this couldn't last, that we were living on borrowed time, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. Not yet. When he finally left, slipping out just as the sun rose, I felt a strange mix of loss and exhilaration, like I had tasted something forbidden and couldn't bear to let it go. The affair with Jake became a secret rhythm in my life, a private world that existed only between the two of us. Each stolen moment, each whispered word, added to the thrill, but it also stoked a new kind of restlessness, a hunger that became harder to satisfy. There was a part of me that knew this couldn't last, that I was building a castle in the sand, but I couldn't stop myself. With each encounter, we were digging deeper, pulling each other further into something neither of us fully understood. Every time we met, we took greater risks. We'd meet at odd hours, sometimes in the secluded woods behind our neighborhood, sometimes at the lake, sometimes even in his car. We were careful, always keeping an eye out, but a part of me began to crave the idea of being caught, as if that would give a name to this thing between us, something that I could finally see for what it truly was. One afternoon, I received a text from Jake that sent a thrill through me. "Meet me in the park, same place as last time." I glanced at the clock. Tom was supposed to be home later that evening, so I had to be quick. I grabbed my keys, heart racing as I slipped out the back door, and made my way to the park. The air was warm and thick with the scent of blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the tension that swirled inside me. When I arrived, Jake was waiting beneath the trees, leaning against the trunk with that familiar, casual confidence. He looked up as I approached, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Hey," he said, his voice low and warm. "Hey," I replied, barely able to keep my composure as I stepped closer. Without a word, he reached out, pulling me into his arms. Our lips met in a kiss that felt both urgent and tender, a mixture of passion and restraint that left me breathless. It was the kind of kiss that blurred the lines between love and lust, a feeling that left me dizzy with longing. "I missed you," he murmured, his hand brushing against my cheek. "I missed you too," I replied, feeling a pang of guilt, even as the words left my lips. We stood there in silence, the world around us fading into the background. I knew that this was dangerous, that we were playing with fire, but I couldn't bring myself to care. In that moment, all that mattered was the warmth of his embrace, the safety of his arms. Over the next few weeks, we met more frequently, slipping away whenever we could find a moment. I knew that I was becoming reckless, that the careful boundaries I had set were beginning to crumble, but the thrill of it all was too intoxicating to resist. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, each encounter filling me with a sense of purpose that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. But with each meeting, the weight of guilt grew heavier. I found myself lying to Tom more often, making excuses for my absences, avoiding his gaze whenever he asked about my day. He seemed to notice the change in me, his eyes lingering a little too long, his questions a little too probing. I told myself that I was just imagining things, that he couldn't possibly suspect anything, but a part of me knew that I was only fooling myself. One evening, as I returned home from one of our secret meetings, I found Tom waiting for me in the kitchen, his arms crossed, a look of quiet frustration on his face. "Hey," he said, his voice tight. "Where were you?" I froze, my mind racing as I scrambled for an answer. I went for a walk," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I needed some air." He nodded, his gaze piercing. "It's just, you've been out a lot lately. I barely see you anymore." I felt a pang of guilt, the weight of my lies pressing down on me. "I'm sorry," I murmured, looking down at my hands. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Rachel, is there something going on? You seem distant." I swallowed, forcing a smile as I shook my head. "No, nothing's going on. I guess I've been a little restless." He didn't look convinced, but he let it go, his shoulders slumping as he turned away. I watched him leave, a mixture of guilt and relief swirling inside me. I knew that I was walking a fine line, that one misstep could shatter the fragile balance I had created, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. The thrill of it all was too strong, the pull of Jake's presence too powerful to resist. As the weeks passed, the tension between Tom and me grew, the unspoken suspicion casting a shadow over our home. I found myself withdrawing more and more, avoiding his touch, his questions, his presence. I knew he could sense the change in me, but I didn't have the strength to confront it. Every time I looked at him, all I could see was the weight of my guilt, a reminder of the choices I had made and the consequences that would inevitably follow. But with Jake, everything felt different. In his arms, I felt free, unburdened by the expectations and responsibilities that weighed me down. He was my escape, my sanctuary, the one place where I could be myself without fear or judgment. One evening, as we lay tangled together beneath the stars, he turned to me, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice soft, "have you ever thought about leaving?" The question took me by surprise, a pang of fear and excitement tightening in my chest. "Leaving?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Leaving this life, starting over, just you and me." I felt a thrill at the thought, a surge of adrenaline that left me breathless. The idea was reckless, impossible, but in that moment, it felt like the answer to everything. A chance to escape the lies, the guilt, the weight of my choices. But as the initial excitement faded, reality began to settle in. Leaving meant tearing apart everything I had built, destroying the life I had shared with Tom, and facing the consequences of my actions. It was a fantasy, a beautiful, dangerous fantasy, but one that could never come true. I don't know, I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I could do that." He nodded, a hint of disappointment flickering in his eyes. "I understand," he murmured, his hand brushing against mine. "But if you ever change your mind, I'll be here." We lay in silence, the weight of his words settling between us. I knew that I couldn't leave, that I couldn't throw away everything for a fleeting moment of happiness. But the idea lingered, a spark that refused to be extinguished, a reminder of the life I could have if I was brave enough to reach for it. But life has a way of forcing decisions, of shattering illusions in the most brutal ways. One afternoon, as I was preparing to meet Jake, I received a call from Tom. "Hey Rachel," he said, his voice tight. "I just got home. Where are you?" My heart skipped a beat, panic surging through me. I'm just running errands," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll be home soon." There was a pause, and I could hear the tension in his silence. "Rachel, we need to talk. When you get home." My stomach twisted, a sense of dread settling over me. I could feel the walls closing in, the weight of my lies pressing down on me. I knew that I couldn't keep this up, that the facade was beginning to crack. But I didn't know how to stop. I was caught in a web of my own making, a tangle of secrets and lies that I couldn't escape. When I finally returned home, Tom was waiting for me, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. "Rachel," he began, his voice low. "I know." The words hung in the air, a confession that shattered everything. I felt my heart stop, the weight of his gaze pinning me in place. "You know?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I don't know everything, but I know enough." I felt a wave of nausea, the ground shifting beneath me as the truth came crashing down. I had known this day would come, that I couldn't keep up the charade forever, but the reality was more devastating than I could have imagined. For a moment we just stood there, the silence stretching out between us, filled with the weight of our unspoken truths. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Why?" I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know," I whispered, feeling the tears begin to fall. "I don't know." In that moment I felt the full weight of my choices, the consequences of my actions crashing down around me. I had destroyed everything, torn apart the life we had built, all for a fleeting moment of happiness that I could never hold on to. As I stood there, the reality of my situation settling over me, I sat on the floor for what felt like hours, my heart still pounding from the intensity of Tom's gaze, the quiet devastation in his eyes as he'd walked away. I could still feel his presence in the house, the heavy silence pressing down on me, amplifying the emptiness left in the wake of our confrontation. Every word we had exchanged, every accusation, lingered in the air, haunting me, as if the truth of my betrayal was woven to the walls of our home, an indelible mark that could never be erased. The reality of what I'd done sank in slowly, like a cold wave washing over me. I had betrayed him not only through my actions with Jake, but in the way I had hidden it, kept it from him, and pretended like everything was normal. I'd convinced myself that I was justified, that my unhappiness somehow excused the lies. But now, as I sat alone in the darkness, I realized how naive that belief had been. I didn't sleep that night. I wandered through the empty rooms, the familiar spaces that now felt foreign, each one filled with memories of a life I had shattered. I found myself in our bedroom, staring at the framed photos on the dresser, the smiles frozen in time, a reminder of what we once had. My fingers trembled as I traced the edge of one frame, a photo from our first anniversary, our faces alight with laughter. The memory seemed distant, like a dream I could barely remember. The hours stretched on, the silence deepening until dawn finally broke, casting a pale light through the curtains. I felt hollow, like I had been emptied of everything that once made me who I was. I knew I had to confront Tom, to face the full reality of what I had done, but the thought filled me with dread. Just as I gathered the courage to find him, my phone buzzed. The name flashing on the screen made my heart clench Jake. I hesitated, torn between the desire to hear his voice and the guilt that now colored every thought of him. But I couldn't ignore it. I pressed accept, my voice barely a whisper as I answered. "Rachel," his voice was soft, comforting, a balm to the raw wound in my chest. I had a feeling something was wrong. "Are you okay?" The sound of his concern brought fresh tears to my eyes. I wanted to tell him everything, to pour out my heart and let him share the burden of my guilt, but I knew that was impossible. This wasn't something he could fix. "Tom, he knows, Jake," I managed, my voice breaking. There was a heavy silence on the other end, the weight of my words sinking in. When he finally spoke, his tone was laced with regret. "Rachel, I'm so sorry. I never wanted this to happen to you." "It's not your fault," I whispered, clutching the phone as if it were a lifeline. This was my choice. I knew what I was doing. A part of me wanted him to argue, to insist that we were in this together, that he would stand by me no matter what. But he didn't. He simply listened, his silence filled with an understanding that made the guilt even sharper. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice gentle. The question echoed in my mind, a reminder of the decision I had been avoiding. I knew I couldn't go on like this, living a double life, trapped between two worlds that were tearing me apart. But the thought of letting go of either life filled me with fear. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the weight of the truth settle over me. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to make that choice." He let out a sigh, a sound filled with quiet resignation. "Whatever you decide, Rachel, I'm here for you." The words hung between us, a promise I didn't deserve, but one that filled me with a strange sense of comfort. We said our goodbyes, the silence that followed heavier than before. The days that followed were a blur of empty moments, each one bleeding into the next. Tom and I drifted through the house like strangers, the weight of our unspoken truths hanging over us, a barrier that neither of us dared to break. We existed in a kind of suspended state, each of us waiting for the other to make the first move, to say the words that would either mend or destroy what was left of our marriage. I found myself avoiding Jake too, the thrill of our encounters now tainted by the guilt that clung to me like a shadow. I missed him, the warmth of his presence, the way he made me feel alive, but I couldn't bring myself to face him, not with the specter of my betrayal looming over every thought, every memory. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, Tom finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "We can't go on like this, Rachel," he said, his gaze steady. "Something has to change." I looked up, my heart pounding as I met his gaze. The sadness in his eyes was still there, but it was tempered with something else, a determination, a resolve that took me by surprise. "I know," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. I just don't know how to fix this." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his frustration. "I don't think this is something we can fix, Rachel, not the way things are now." The words struck me like a blow, the finality of them leaving me breathless. He was right, of course. We couldn't go back to the way things were. Too much had been broken. Too many lies had been told. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of the question. He looked away, his jaw tense. "I want you to be honest, Rachel. With me, with yourself. I need to know if you still want this marriage." The question hung between us, a challenge I couldn't ignore. I felt a surge of anger, a defensiveness that rose unbidden. How could he put this on me? As if I were the only one responsible for the distance between us. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it was a lie. I had made the choice to seek comfort elsewhere, to betray the vows we had made to each other. "I don't know, Tom," I whispered, feeling the weight of my own words settle over me. "I don't know if I can give you the answer you want." He nodded, a look of resignation crossing his face. "Then maybe we both need some time to figure out what we really want." We decided to separate, a decision that felt both inevitable and surreal. Tom moved into a small apartment across town, leaving me alone in the house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of the life I had thrown away, the choices that had led me to this place. I tried to fill the emptiness with work, with routines, but nothing seemed to ease the aches that gnawed at me, a hollow feeling that seemed to grow with each passing day. Jake reached out a few times, his messages filled with concern, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I knew that he cared, that he wanted to help, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was part of the reason I had ended up here, alone and adrift. One evening, as I sat in the empty house, I found myself scrolling through old photos, images of a life that now felt like a distant memory. There were photos of Tom and me, smiling and carefree, our faces alight with the kind of happiness that now seemed impossible to recapture. I felt a pang of regret, a sense of loss that I couldn't shake. And then there was a knock at the door. My heart leaped, a mixture of hope and fear tightening in my chest. I opened the door to find Jake standing there, his face filled with a quiet determination that mirrored my own. "I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not when I know you're hurting." I felt a surge of relief, a warmth that chased away the emptiness, if only for a moment. But even as I stepped aside to let him in, I knew that this was only a temporary comfort, a fleeting escape from the pain that lingered just beneath the surface. We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us daring to speak, as if words might shatter the fragile peace we had found in each other's presence. And in that silence, I realized that this wasn't the life I wanted, that I couldn't keep running from the truth of my choices. "Jake," I began, my voice trembling. "I don't know if we can ever be more than what we are right now." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness that echoed my own. "I know," he replied, his voice barely audible. "But for now, can we just be here? Together?" I nodded, feeling a tear slip down my cheek. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace, a fragile, tenuous peace that held me in place, if only for a moment. As the night wore on, I knew that I still had a long road ahead, that the choices I had made would continue to haunt me, to shape the life I had yet to build. But for now, in the quiet of the empty house, with Jake by my side, I allowed myself to hope for something better, something that might one day fill the emptiness I had created. The days following Tom's departure were surreal. The house, once a haven, now felt like a hollow shell, each room filled with the quiet echoes of a life I had dismantled. The weight of his absence settled over me like a thick fog, a constant reminder of everything I had lost and the choices that had led me here. In the absence of Tom's presence, I found myself reaching for Jake more and more. Our encounters, once fleeting and filled with the thrill of secrecy, now took on a different tone, more desperate, as if we were trying to fill the emptiness that lingered in the wake of my separation. Yet, even in his arms, I couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at me, a persistent reminder that I was still standing on the edge of something dangerous. One afternoon, as I wandered through the empty house, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jake. "I need to see you. Can you come over?" The words sent a thrill through me, but they also filled me with a sense of dread. I knew that our meetings were becoming more frequent, more intense, and the boundaries I had tried to set were beginning to crumble. Yet, I couldn't bring myself to say no. Jake had become my anchor, the one steady presence in a world that seemed to be spinning out of control. Within minutes, I found myself at his door, my heart racing as I stepped inside. Jake greeted me with a warmth that chased away the lingering sadness, his smile a balm to the raw wound left by Tom's absence. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice filled with an intensity that left me breathless. "I've missed you." Before I could respond, he pulled me into his arms, our lips meeting in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. I felt the familiar rush of desire, the thrill of being with him washing over me, filling the emptiness that had settled in my chest. We moved through his home together, our touches desperate, as if we were trying to cling to something we both knew was slipping away. But as the intensity of our embrace faded, a sense of unease began to settle over me. I looked up at him, searching his gaze for the reassurance I needed, but instead I saw something else, a hint of doubt, a flicker of uncertainty that mirrored my own. "Jake," I began, my voice trembling. What are we doing?" He sighed, pulling me close as he rested his chin on my head. "I don't know, Rachel," he admitted, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. "All I know is that I want to be with you. But this isn't easy. I can feel that you're holding back." I closed my eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on me. He was right, of course. I was holding back, unable to fully commit to a life with him, torn between the lingering guilt over my failed marriage and the undeniable pull of our connection. I wanted to believe that we could find happiness together, that we could escape the mess I had created, but the reality was more complicated, more painful than I had allowed myself to admit. Do you think we could ever make this work?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked down at me, his gaze filled with a sadness that echoed my own. "I want to believe that we can," he murmured, his hand gently tracing the line of my jaw. "But Rachel, there's a part of you that's still tied to him, isn't there?" The question hung between us, a challenge I couldn't ignore. I wanted to deny it, to insist that I had moved on, that my heart was free to give to him. But the truth was more complicated. Tom was still a part of me, a presence that lingered in the quiet spaces of my mind, a reminder of the life I had left behind. And as much as I wanted to forget, to erase the guilt and the pain, I knew that it would never be that simple. "I don't know, Jake," I admitted, feeling a tear slip down my cheek. "I don't know if I'll ever be free of him." He nodded, a look of resignation crossing his face. "Then maybe we need to take a step back, figure out what we really want." The words hit me like a blow, the reality of our situation crashing down around me. I knew that he was right, that we couldn't go on like this, clinging to a fantasy that would never hold up under the weight of our choices. But the thought of losing him, of letting go of the one person who had made me feel alive, filled me with a sense of despair I couldn't shake. "Jake, please," I whispered, my voice filled with desperation. "I don't want to lose you." He looked at me, his gaze filled with a mix of longing and regret. "Rachel, I don't want to lose you either. But maybe we need to give ourselves a chance to heal." The words lingered in the air, a painful truth I couldn't deny. We stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, clinging to the fragile connection we had built, but I could feel it slipping away, the weight of our choices pressing down on us, threatening to tear us apart. The next few days were a blur of emptiness, each one bleeding into the next, as I struggled to come to terms with the reality of my situation. Jake had become a ghost, a presence that lingered in the corners of my mind, a reminder of the life I had thrown away. I found myself wandering through the empty house, the silence filling me with a sense of loss I couldn't shake. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I heard a knock at the door. My heart leapt, a mixture of hope and fear tightening in my chest, as I opened it to find Tom standing there, his face filled with a quiet determination. "Rachel," he began, his voice steady, "we need to talk." I nodded, feeling a wave of guilt wash over me as I stepped aside to let him in. We sat across from each other, the silence between us filled with the weight of our unspoken truths. I could see the sadness in his eyes, the hurt that lingered just beneath the surface, a reminder of the pain I had caused. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, his gaze steady. "And I realized that I'm not blameless in this. I know that I've been distant, that I've let work and life pull me away from you, and I'm sorry for that." The apology took me by surprise, a flicker of warmth sparking in my chest. I wanted to reach out to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that I was the one who had made the choice to betray him, but the words caught in my throat. "I know that things will never be the same between us," he continued, his voice filled with quiet resignation. "But I also know that I don't want to throw away everything we've built. If you're willing, I'd like to try, to see if we can rebuild what we've lost." The offer left me speechless, a mixture of relief and guilt flooding my mind. I had expected anger, resentment, a desire to leave the past behind, but instead, he was offering me a chance at redemption, a chance to heal the wounds I had caused. "Tom, I don't know if I deserve that," I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his gaze softening. "Maybe we both don't. But I think we owe it to ourselves to try." We sat in silence, the weight of his words settling over me like a balm, soothing the ache that had lingered in my chest for weeks. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the pain of my choices would continue to haunt me, but for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, tenuous hope that we might be able to find a way forward. As he left, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet reassurance that I wasn't alone in this journey. I knew that Jake would always hold a place in my heart, a reminder of the passion and freedom I had once craved. But I also knew that my path lay with Tom, in the life we had built together, in the love that had weathered the storms of betrayal and regret. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of purpose, a determination to rebuild, to mend the fractures in my heart and in my marriage. The journey ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and painful memories, but I was ready to face it, to embrace the choices that had led me here, and to find a way forward, one step at a time. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. Tom's words had given me a lifeline, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to put my shattered life back together. But as the day wore on, I found myself torn, my mind drifting back to Jake. The feelings I had tried so hard to bury now resurfacing with a renewed intensity. I spent hours pacing the house, my thoughts a tangled mess. I knew that moving forward meant leaving the past behind, letting go of the parts of myself that had driven me down this path. But how could I simply forget Jake? He was more than a fleeting infatuation. He was a reminder of the person I had wanted to become, of the freedom I had craved in the confines of my marriage. The thought of saying goodbye to him felt like severing a part of my own heart. In the late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself dialing his number. My hands shook as I pressed call, the familiar thrill mixing with a sense of dread. I knew this was dangerous, that any contact would only complicate things further, but the pull was too strong. I needed closure, one final encounter to put an end to the longing that had haunted me since Tom had re-entered my life. Jake answered on the third ring, his voice warm and filled with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Rachel," he murmured, his tone laced with a mixture of surprise and longing. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again." I need to see you, Jake," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "One last time." There was a pause, a hesitation that hinted at the same conflict raging within me. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "No," I admitted, feeling a pang of guilt. "But I need this. I need to say goodbye." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Finally, he agreed, his voice tinged with sadness. "All right, meet me by the lake at 8. The lake was cloaked in twilight when I arrived, the stillness of the water reflecting the darkening sky. I spotted Jake near the shore, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable, a mixture of hope and resignation that mirrored my own. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of our past lingering between us. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance and lose myself in his embrace one last time, but I held back, my heart heavy with the knowledge of the choice I had to make. "Thank you for meeting me," I said, my voice trembling. He nodded, his gaze intense. "I didn't think I'd get the chance to see you again. I thought," he trailed off, struggling to find the words. "I thought you'd chosen him." "I don't know if it's that simple," I replied, my heart aching at the look in his eyes. "I care about you, Jake, more than I can say. But Tom and I, we've shared a life. There's a part of me that feels I owe it to us to try and fix what I broke." He looked away, his jaw tense, his hands clenched at his sides. "I understand, Rachel. I always knew you might choose him. But it doesn't make this any easier." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, the weight of his words sinking into my heart. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't mean to let it get this far." He sighed, his gaze softening as he took a step closer. "I know. And I don't regret a single moment, Rachel. You gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. But maybe this is where our story ends." I looked up at him, the reality of his words settling over me. I had wanted closure, an ending that would allow me to move forward. But now, as I stood on the brink of goodbye, I felt a surge of desperation, a last-ditch hope that maybe we could find a way to keep each other. "Jake," I began, my voice filled with the words I couldn't bring myself to say. He shook his head, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "Rachel, don't. We both know that staying in this half-life isn't fair to either of us." The truth of his words hit me like a blow, the finality of them leaving me breathless. He was right. Of course. We couldn't continue like this, clinging to the remnants of something that could never truly be ours. I had to let him go, to release him from the tangled web of my emotions, even if it meant facing the emptiness that lay ahead. Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand gently brushing against my cheek. The touch was soft, tender, filled with a kind of reverence that left me aching. "Take care of yourself, Rachel," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "And find happiness, whatever that means for you." With those final words, he leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to savor the warmth of his touch one last time, to hold on to the memory that would stay with me long after he was gone. When I opened my eyes, he was already walking away, his figure fading into the shadows as he disappeared down the path. I stood by the water, the silence pressing down on me, filling the empty space he had left behind. The drive home was a blur, the streets passing in a haze as I struggled to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Jake was gone, truly gone, and the realization left me feeling hollow, like a part of myself had been ripped away. I had known that letting go would be painful, that saying goodbye would leave a scar, but I hadn't expected the depth of the ache that now settled in my chest. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw the light on in the kitchen, a reminder of the life I still had, the life I had chosen to rebuild. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before stepping inside, the quiet warmth of the house greeting me like an old friend. In the kitchen, I found Tom sitting at the table, his face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet determination. He looked up as I entered, a flicker of relief crossing his features. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice filled with a tentative hope. Are you okay?" I nodded, feeling a fresh wave of guilt wash over me. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely audible. I had to say goodbye to him." He nodded, his gaze softening as he reached out, his hand resting over mine. The gesture was simple, but it was enough to remind me of the love we had shared, the life we had built together, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. "I know this won't be easy," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "But I want to try, Rachel. I want to make this work." I looked into his eyes, the depth of his forgiveness filling me with a sense of hope I hadn't felt in months. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the pain of my choices would continue to haunt me, but for the first time, I felt a glimmer of peace, a fragile hope that we could find a way forward. We sat in silence, our hands intertwined, each of us holding on to the possibility of a new beginning. And in that moment, I realized that while the past would always be a part of me, it didn't have to define my future. I could choose to let go, to forgive myself, and to embrace the love that had endured despite everything. The journey would be long, filled with challenges and moments of doubt, but I was ready to face it, to rebuild, to find a way forward. And as I sat there, the warmth of Tom's hand in mine, I allowed myself to hope for something better, something that might one day fill the emptiness I had created. The first few days after I said goodbye to Jake were filled with a quiet emptiness. I moved through the house, completing everyday tasks that felt surreal, as if I were watching my life play out from a distance. Tom was here, filling the empty spaces that had once been so silent. But there was a new hesitance between us, a cautiousness that hadn't existed before. We were two people who knew each other deeply, but had become strangers, scarred by our shared pain and the wounds left by my choices. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table, Tom cleared his throat, his voice tentative. "Rachel, I think we need to talk." I looked up, my heart pounding, bracing myself for the conversation I knew was coming. He was right, of course. We couldn't move forward without addressing the hurt that lingered between us, the silent resentment and guilt that had begun to fester. "Okay," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "Let's talk." He took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I don't want this to be about blame or accusations. I need to understand, Rachel. I need to know why." The question hung in the air, filled with the weight of his hurt and the need for answers. I felt a pang of guilt, the shame of my actions settling over me like a heavy cloak. I had prepared myself for anger, for resentment, but his quiet determination to understand was somehow harder to bear. I don't know where to start," I admitted, feeling my voice tremble. He reached across the table, his hand resting over mine. "Just tell me the truth. Whatever it is, I can handle it. I'd rather know the truth than spend the rest of my life wondering." I nodded, taking a deep breath as I gathered my thoughts. I was lonely, Tom. I felt invisible, like I was just going through the motions every day. And when Jake came along, he made me feel seen, noticed in a way I hadn't felt in years. He looked down, his jaw tight, I could see the pain in his eyes, the hurt that lingered beneath the surface, but he didn't pull his hand away. "I know I've been distant," he murmured, his voice laced with regret. "I let work and life pull me away from you, and I'm sorry for that." "It wasn't just your fault," I replied, feeling the sting of my own guilt. "I could have talked to you, told you how I felt. But I didn't. I kept it inside, and instead of facing it, I looked for comfort somewhere else." The admission left me feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't anticipated. But as I looked across the table, I saw the same vulnerability reflected in his gaze, a shared understanding that we had both contributed to the rift that had grown between us. "Rachel," he began, his voice soft, "do you still have feelings for him?" The question took me by surprise, a painful reminder of the lingering emotions I hadn't yet fully let go of. I wanted to say no, to insist that my heart was free, but the truth was more complicated. I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I cared about him, Tom. But I chose to say goodbye, to let him go, because I want to try and rebuild what we have. I want to make this work." He nodded, a look of quiet relief crossing his face. "Then that's all I need to know." We sat in silence, the weight of our conversation settling over us like a balm, soothing the raw edges of our hurt. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was a start, a fragile foundation on which we could begin to rebuild. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and moments of doubt, but for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a tentative belief that we could find our way back to each other. The days that followed were a delicate dance of small gestures, tentative attempts at reconnecting in a way that felt both familiar and foreign. Tom would leave little notes for me in the morning. A simple "have a great day," or "I love you" scribbled on a scrap of paper, tucked into the places he knew I'd find them. I'd cook his favorite meals, the ones we used to share on lazy Sundays, filling the house with the sense of our past, hoping to rekindle the warmth we had once known. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, watching an old movie we'd seen a dozen times, I felt the urge to reach out to bridge the distance that still lingered between us. I rested my head on his shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that felt like a step toward the intimacy we had lost. He glanced down, a small smile tugging at his lips, and for a moment I saw the man I had fallen in love with. The warmth in his gaze a reminder of the love that had weathered the storms of our past. But even as we grew closer, I couldn't shake the guilt that lingered, a shadow that clung to me no matter how hard I tried to push it away. I found myself replaying moments from the past, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, a way to erase the mistakes that had led us here. Each time I looked at Tom, I felt a pang of regret, a reminder of the hurt I had caused, the trust I had broken. One night, as we lay in bed, the darkness settling over us like a blanket, I found myself unable to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of the past. I could feel Tom's presence beside me, his steady breathing a comfort, but the guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder of the choices I had made. "Tom," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "can I ask you something?" He turned to face me, his gaze soft in the dim light. "Of course." I took a deep breath, the weight of my question settling over me. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me?" He was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Rachel, I think forgiveness is a process. It's not something that happens overnight. But I'm willing to try, because I believe that what we have is worth fighting for." His words filled me with a sense of relief, a quiet reassurance that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. I knew that forgiveness wouldn't come easily, that it would take time and patience. But the fact that he was willing to try was enough to give me hope. As the weeks turned into months, we continued to rebuild, each day a new opportunity to strengthen the fragile bond we had begun to mend. We sought counseling, attending weekly sessions that forced us to confront the pain and resentment that lingered beneath the surface, to address the wounds that had yet to fully heal. It was a difficult process, filled with moments of anger and tears, but it was also a chance to rediscover each other, to reconnect in a way that felt honest and real. Our counselor encouraged us to be open, to share our thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment. We learned to communicate in a way that we hadn't before, to express our needs and desires in a way that was both vulnerable and respectful. I shared my fears, my regrets, the moments of doubt that had driven me to seek comfort elsewhere. And in return, Tom shared his own struggles, his feelings of inadequacy, the pressures that had pulled him away from me. Through these sessions, I began to see him in a new light, not just as my husband, but as a person with his own fears and insecurities. And in that understanding, I found a new appreciation for the man I had married, a quiet admiration that rekindled the love I had once thought lost. But even as we grew closer, I knew that the journey was far from over. There were days when the past would resurface, a painful reminder of the choices I had made, the trust I had broken. I could see the hurt in Tom's eyes, the lingering doubts that would never fully disappear. And each time, I felt a pang of guilt, a reminder that some wounds could never be fully healed. One evening, as we sat together on the back porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Tom took my hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "Rachel," he began, his voice filled with quiet determination, "I want you to know that I'm committed to this, to us. I believe that we can make this work, that we can rebuild what we've lost. But I also know that it's going to take time." I looked up at him, my heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and hope. "I know, Tom, and I'm committed to this too. I want to make things right, to prove to you that I'm worthy of your forgiveness." He smiled, a small, gentle smile that filled me with a sense of peace. "Then we'll take it one day at a time. We'll rebuild together." In that moment, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet reassurance that, despite the mistakes of the past, we could find a way to move forward. The journey ahead would be long, filled with challenges and moments of doubt, but I was ready to face it, to embrace the life we had chosen to rebuild, and to find a way forward, one step at a time. The nights were the hardest. During the day, we busied ourselves with work, with counseling, with carefully rehearsed routines that gave us a sense of progress. But in the stillness of the night, the silence between us became a reminder of everything we had lost and everything we were still trying to rebuild. There were nights when I would lie awake, feeling Tom's presence beside me, close yet distant. I could feel the tension in his body, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. I knew he was struggling to reconcile the love we had shared with the betrayal that had torn us apart, and I couldn't blame him. I was struggling too, haunted by memories of Jake, the guilt that clung to me, and the gnawing fear that I would never truly be able to earn Tom's forgiveness. One night, as we lay in bed, I decided to break the silence. I turned to him, my voice barely a whisper as I spoke. "Tom," I began, my heart pounding, "I know that this hasn't been easy for you, and I want you to know that I'm here. Whatever you need, whatever questions you have, I'm here to listen." He looked over at me, his expression softening as he reached for my hand. "Rachel, I know you're sorry. I can see how hard you're trying, but sometimes I feel like I'm still holding on to so much anger, so much hurt. I don't want to feel this way, but I don't know how to let it go." His words were a painful reminder of the depth of the hurt I had caused, the wounds that would take time to heal. I felt a pang of guilt, a surge of regret that left me breathless. "I understand," I murmured, squeezing his hand. "I don't expect you to just forget what happened, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. But maybe we both need to learn to forgive ourselves too." He was silent for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "Forgiving myself," he echoed, as if the idea were foreign. "I never thought of it that way." "I think we've both made mistakes," I continued, my voice steady. "And if we're going to rebuild, we have to let go of the guilt, the blame. We have to start fresh, without holding on to the past." He nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "You're right. Maybe I've been so focused on what happened that I've forgotten how to move forward. Maybe it's time to let go." The words felt like a breakthrough, a tentative step toward healing. We sat in silence, the weight of our conversation settling over us like a balm, soothing the wounds that had lingered beneath the surface. In the days that followed, I noticed a change in Tom, a quiet determination to let go of the anger, to embrace the possibility of forgiveness. He began to open up more, sharing his fears, his doubts, the moments of resentment that had once threatened to tear us apart. And in return, I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to share my own regrets, the guilt that had haunted me, the desire to rebuild and make amends. We began to spend more time together, rediscovering the parts of our relationship that had once brought us joy. We went on quiet walks through the neighborhood, hand in hand, the simple act of connection a reminder of the bond we had shared. We cooked meals together, reminiscing over old recipes and memories, filling the house with laughter and warmth. But even as we grew closer, there were moments of tension, reminders of the hurt that lingered. I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of doubt that would appear when he caught me lost in thought, the questions that lingered just below the surface. I knew that he was struggling to trust me again, to believe in the love we had once shared, and I didn't blame him. Trust, I realized, was something that would have to be rebuilt piece by piece, a fragile foundation that would take time to strengthen. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set, he turned to me, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity. "Rachel," he began, his voice steady, "I need to know, do you still think about him?" The question took me by surprise, a painful reminder of the emotions I had tried so hard to bury. I wanted to deny it, to insist that Jake was nothing more than a memory, but the truth was more complicated. He had been a part of my life, a reminder of the person I had wanted to become, and his presence still lingered, a quiet echo that refused to be silenced. "I think part of me will always remember him," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But he's in the past, Tom, and I chose to leave him there because I want to build a future with you." He looked down, his jaw tight, but he nodded, a flicker of acceptance crossing his face. "Thank you for being honest," he murmured, his voice soft. I needed to hear that. The conversation left us both feeling raw, exposed in a way that was both painful and healing. But I knew that it was a step toward rebuilding trust, a foundation on which we could begin to strengthen the bond that had once held us together. In the following months, our relationship continued to evolve, each day a new opportunity to heal, to grow, to rebuild. We worked through our fears, our doubts, the lingering shadows of the past, embracing the vulnerability that had once threatened to tear us apart. I found a new appreciation for Tom, a quiet admiration for his strength, his patience, his willingness to forgive. Through our counseling sessions, we learned to communicate in a way that was honest, respectful, and open. We shared our hopes, our dreams, our desires, rediscovering the love that had been buried beneath the weight of our mistakes. And in that openness, I found a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to the life we were building together. But there were still moments of doubt, moments when the past would resurface, a painful reminder of the choices I had made. I could see the flicker of hurt in Tom's eyes, the memories that lingered just below the surface, a reminder that some wounds would never fully heal. But I also saw the determination in his gaze, the quiet resolve that told me he was willing to keep fighting, to keep moving forward. One night, as we sat together in the living room, the fire casting a warm glow over the room, he took my hand, his grip gentle yet firm. "Rachel," he began, his voice filled with quiet determination, "I want you to know that I've forgiven you. It wasn't easy, and there are days when the past still haunts me. But I believe that we're stronger than this, that we can build something even better." His words filled me with a sense of relief, a quiet reassurance that the journey we had embarked on was worth the struggle, worth the pain. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, a mixture of gratitude and hope that left me breathless. "Thank you, Tom," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I promise I will do everything I can to make this right, to prove that I'm worthy of your love." He smiled, a small, gentle smile that filled me with a sense of peace. "We're in this together, Rachel, and I believe that, no matter what happens, we'll make it through. One day at a time." In that moment, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet reassurance that, despite the mistakes of the past, we could find a way to move forward. The journey ahead would be long, filled with challenges and moments of doubt, but I was ready to face it, to embrace the life we had chosen to rebuild, and to find a way forward, one step at a time. Life began to take on a new rhythm, one marked by simplicity and careful attention. Each day, Tom and I navigated the fragile path we had chosen, our interactions filled with an unspoken tenderness that seemed to emerge only in the aftermath of all we had endured. There were moments when the old memories, the pain, the regret, the mistakes would resurface, casting a shadow over our days. But as time went on, those memories grew softer, fading like the edges of an old photograph, blurring into the background of our lives. One crisp morning, as I stood in the kitchen making coffee, I caught a glimpse of Tom sitting by the window, lost in thought as he looked out over the backyard. The sun was just rising, casting a warm glow across his face, illuminating the lines that had appeared around his eyes, marks of the struggles we had shared. For a moment, I simply watched him, my heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and love. The man I saw before me was no longer the husband I had once known, but a person who had endured, who had chosen to forgive, to rebuild, to walk beside me on a path that was anything but easy. He must have sensed my gaze, for he looked over and smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that reminded me of the early days of our marriage. I walked over, setting a cup of coffee down in front of him, our hands brushing as we shared a moment of quiet understanding. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice soft. "For the coffee?" I teased, a smile tugging at my lips. "No," he replied, his gaze steady. "For staying. For not giving up on us." The words took me by surprise, a reminder of the journey we had undertaken, the battles we had fought, both together and separately. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, a mixture of gratitude and relief washing over me. "I wouldn't have it any other way," I whispered, my voice filled with quiet conviction. As the months passed, our relationship continued to evolve, each day a new opportunity to strengthen the bond we had begun to rebuild. We attended our counseling sessions faithfully, discussing our fears, our hopes, our plans for the future. I began to notice a change in myself, a new willingness to be vulnerable, to share my thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment or rejection. And in that vulnerability, I found a new strength, a resilience that had once seemed elusive. Tom, too, began to open up more, sharing parts of himself that he had once kept hidden, the pressures he had felt, the insecurities that had driven him to focus so much on work. He spoke of his fear of failure, of not being able to provide for us, to give me the life he believed I deserved. And in those moments of honesty, I saw the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had been waiting, hidden beneath the layers of distance and responsibility. Our counselor encouraged us to set new goals, to create shared dreams that would give us something to work toward. We began to plan small trips, weekend getaways to places we had always wanted to visit but had never found the time for. We took up new hobbies, exploring interests we had both neglected in the busyness of life. It was a journey of discovery, a chance to reconnect not only with each other but with ourselves. But despite the progress we had made, there were still moments of doubt, moments when the past would resurface, a painful reminder of the choices I had made. I could see the flicker of uncertainty in Tom's eyes, the questions that lingered just below the surface, a reminder that some wounds would take longer to heal. One evening, as we sat together by the fire, I felt the need to address the lingering tension, to confront the doubts that had been simmering beneath the surface. I turned to him, my heart pounding as I spoke. "Tom," I began, my voice steady, "I know that things haven't been easy for us, and I want you to know that I'm committed to this, to us. But if there's anything you need, anything you want to ask, I'm here. I don't want there to be any more secrets between us." He looked at me, his gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "Rachel, I don't have any questions. I think I've finally made peace with what happened. It took me a long time to get here, but I know now that we can't change the past. All we can do is move forward, one day at a time." His words filled me with a sense of peace, a quiet reassurance that our journey was one of healing, of growth, of resilience. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a sense of closure that had eluded me for so long. The months that followed were filled with moments of joy, of laughter, of quiet contentment that had once seemed impossible. We found a new rhythm, a balance between work and home, between the demands of daily life and the commitment we had made to each other. Our love had become something deeper, something forged in the fires of hardship, a resilience that gave us the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the stars twinkle above, Tom turned to me, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice soft, "do you remember when we first met? How we used to dream about the future, about all the things we wanted to do together?" I nodded, a smile tugging at my lips. "I remember. We had so many dreams back then." He took my hand, his grip gentle yet firm. "I think it's time we start dreaming again." The words took me by surprise, a spark of excitement flickering in my chest. For so long, our lives had been defined by the struggles of the past, the mistakes we had made, the wounds we had tried to heal. But now, in the quiet of the night, I felt a sense of hope, a renewed sense of purpose that filled me with anticipation for the future. "Yes," I replied, my voice filled with conviction. "Let's start dreaming again." In the weeks that followed, we began to make plans, setting goals that gave us something to work toward, something to look forward to. We talked about traveling, about visiting places we had always wanted to see, about creating memories that would strengthen the bond we had rebuilt. We began to save for a small cabin in the mountains, a place where we could escape the busyness of life, a sanctuary where we could reconnect with each other and with ourselves. Our journey was far from over, but for the first time I felt a sense of peace, a quiet assurance that we were on the right path. The past would always be a part of us, a reminder of the mistakes we had made, but it no longer defined us. We had chosen to let go, to forgive, to embrace the life we were building together. One day, as we walked hand in hand through the park, watching the leaves fall in a cascade of red and gold, I felt a surge of gratitude, a quiet joy that filled me with a sense of completeness. I had found a love that had endured, a love that had weathered the storms of betrayal and regret, a love that had been tested and had emerged stronger, deeper, more resilient. Tom looked over at me, his gaze filled with a warmth that left me breathless. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I don't know where this journey will take us, but I do know one thing: I want to spend the rest of my life with you." The words were simple, but they held a depth of meaning that left me speechless. I squeezed his hand, my heart swelling with gratitude, with love, with a sense of peace that I had never known. "I want that too," I whispered, my voice filled with emotion. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Tom." And in that moment, I knew that our journey was just beginning. A journey marked by resilience, by forgiveness, by the quiet strength that had carried us through the darkest of days. The past would always be a part of us, but it was no longer a burden, no longer a weight that held us back. It was a reminder of the love we had fought to rebuild, a love that would continue to grow, to deepen, to endure. As we walked together, hand in hand, I felt a sense of hope, a quiet assurance that we were ready to face whatever lay ahead together. The journey had been long, filled with moments of pain and regret, but it had also been one of growth, of healing, of redemption. And as we walked into the future, I knew that we would continue to face life's challenges with the same strength, the same resilience, the same love that had carried us through. Our journey was far from over, but we were already ready to embrace the life we had rebuilt, to cherish the love we had rediscovered, and to dream of a future filled with hope, with joy, with a love that would endure for a lifetime. The months following our decision to start dreaming again felt like the beginning of a new life. Our days were filled with simple joys, quiet laughter, and a steady resolve to leave the past behind while embracing the life we were creating. I no longer looked back with regret or pain. Instead, I saw our journey as one of growth, a story of resilience that had taught us the true meaning of love and forgiveness. One Saturday morning, as we prepared breakfast together, Tom surprised me by bringing up something I hadn't expected. "Rachel," he began, glancing over his shoulder as he flipped a pancake. "I've been thinking about how much has changed, how much we've changed. And I thought, maybe it's time to do something to mark this new chapter." I set down my coffee mug, intrigued. "What did you have in mind?" He looked at me, his eyes warm and filled with quiet determination. "What if we renewed our vows?" The suggestion took me by surprise, a thrill of excitement mixed with a touch of apprehension. The idea of renewing our vows, of standing before each other and reaffirming our love, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. But as I looked into his eyes, I felt a sense of peace, a certainty that this was the right step away to honor the journey we had shared and the love we had rebuilt. "I'd love that," I whispered, my voice filled with emotion. "I can't think of a better way to celebrate everything we've been through." We planned a small, intimate ceremony, inviting only our closest family and friends. The day arrived faster than I expected. And as I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the fabric of my dress, I felt a mixture of anticipation and gratitude. I was no longer the same person I had been when Tom and I had first married. I was stronger, more self-aware, and filled with a deeper appreciation for the love we shared. When I walked out to meet him, I found him standing under an archway adorned with white roses, a soft smile lighting up his face. He looked at me with a tenderness that left me breathless, and in that moment, I knew that every hardship, every moment of doubt, had led us here, to this place of peace and renewal. As we exchanged vows, I felt the weight of our past lifting, replaced by a quiet resolve to cherish each other, to build a life filled with honesty, respect, and unwavering commitment. When he spoke, his voice was steady, filled with a conviction that resonated deep within me. "Rachel," he began, his gaze steady, "I promise to love you, to honor you, and to walk beside you through every challenge, every joy, every sorrow. I know that our journey hasn't been easy, but I also know that it has made us stronger. And today I stand here, ready to begin again, to create a life together that is filled with love, trust, and resilience." I felt a tear slip down my cheek as I took his hands, my heart swelling with gratitude. "Tom," I replied, my voice trembling, "I promise to cherish you, to respect you, and to never take for granted the love we fought so hard to rebuild. I know that I'm not perfect and that our journey has been one of mistakes and lessons learned. But I also know that, together we are stronger, more resilient, and today I choose you now and forever." As we exchanged rings, a symbol of our renewed commitment, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet assurance that we had come full circle. Our past was no longer a burden, but a testament to the strength of our love, a reminder of the journey we had shared. After the ceremony, we gathered with our family and friends, sharing laughter and stories, memories of the past mingling with dreams of the future. I felt a sense of contentment, a peace that had once seemed impossible. As the evening wore on, Tom and I found ourselves sitting together, watching as our loved ones danced, their laughter filling the air. He took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, and looked at me with a smile that was both familiar and new. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice soft, "do you realize how far we've come?" I nodded, my heart swelling with love. "I do. And I'm so grateful for every step, even the painful ones. They've brought us here to this moment." He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. "I love you, Rachel, more than I ever thought possible." "I love you too," I whispered, my voice filled with conviction. "And I can't wait to see what the future holds for us." In the weeks that followed, we settled back into our daily routines, but there was a new warmth, a quiet joy that filled our home. We took more time to connect, to talk, to share our thoughts and feelings. We no longer allowed life to pull us apart. Instead, we embraced each moment, each day, with gratitude. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Tom turned to me, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice filled with a mixture of anticipation and excitement, "what do you think about starting a family?" The question took me by surprise, a mixture of joy and apprehension flooding my mind. For so long we had been focused on healing, on rebuilding what had been broken. But now, as I looked into his eyes, I realized that we were ready to build a future, to create a new chapter filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a life we had fought so hard to reclaim. "I'd love that," I replied, my heart swelling with hope. "I can't think of anything more beautiful." He smiled, a look of pure joy lighting up his face, and in that moment, I knew that we had come full circle, that we had created something beautiful from the ashes of our mistakes, a love that would endure, that would carry us through whatever lay ahead. Our journey was far from over, but I was ready to embrace the life we were building, to cherish the love we had rediscovered, and to face the future with hope, with gratitude, and with a quiet resilience that would guide us through every chapter, every moment, every challenge. As we sat together, hand in hand, watching the stars twinkle above, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet assurance that we were exactly where we were meant to be. The past was no longer a shadow, but a reminder of the strength we had found, the love we had rebuilt, and the future we were ready to embrace. And as the night settled around us, I closed my eyes, allowing myself to dream once more, to imagine a future filled with love, with laughter, with the quiet joy of a life shared, a life that was stronger, deeper, and more beautiful than I had ever dared to hope.